She reached across the table and slid it right off my wrist. No warning, no hesitation, just her fingers closing around my bracelet like it was hers to hold. She lifted it to the light. My bracelet, the one I have worn to every important moment of my life, and she laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Something almost worse than that. A careless one. She turned to her mother and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Didn't you always say this came from a flea market?" And her mother, my sister-in-law, Sandra, did not look up from her plate. She just smiled. The kind of smile that confirms everything without having to say a single word. The table went quiet. My brother, Gary, cleared his throat. My Aunt Ruth, who was sitting at the far end, set down her fork. And I just sat there. I looked at my niece, Kayla, holding my bracelet in the light like she was inspecting a yard sale find. I did not take it back. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself or my mother or the woman who saved for 3 years to buy that piece of jewelry for a daughter she would not live to see grow old. I just waited, because I knew something that nobody else at that table knew yet. And the truth was going to be far more powerful delivered quietly than it ever could have been delivered in anger. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We have viewers joining us tonight from all over the world, and we love knowing you are here. And if this story moves you, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this is the kind of story that does not let go. This is a story about what it means to be underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. About what it means to carry something precious in a world that only recognizes value when it comes with a price tag. And about one woman, Carol Ashby, who spent a lifetime being quietly certain of who she was, even when everyone around her was not. Carol Ashby was 58 years old the evening this story begins. Her brother Gary would call her private. Her sister-in-law Sandra would say difficult. Her Aunt Ruth, who had known Carol since she was 7 years old, would not waste time on adjectives at all. She would simply say, "Carol is the real one. Out of all of them, Carol is the one who is real." She grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the elder of 2 children born to Dorothy Ashby and a man named Frank who left when Carol was 11 and Gary was 8. Dorothy worked 2 jobs for the better part of Carol's childhood, a morning shift at a commercial laundry and an evening shift cashiering at a grocery store 2 miles from their house. She walked to both because she could not afford to run a car, and she never complained about it. Not once, not in front of the children. Carol learned to cook dinner before she turned 12, got herself to school, helped Gary with his homework, and went to bed most nights listening to her mother come through the door after 9, worn down to something quiet and determined. What Carol absorbed from watching Dorothy, though she never would have had the language for it as a child, was that dignity is not something you perform for other people. It is something you maintain for yourself, in private, when no one is watching and there is no audience to reward you for it. That understanding would outlast everything else she ever learned. It would be the thing she reached for, without thinking, every single time life gave her a reason to fold. Carol earned a scholarship to Ohio State, put herself through a graduate program in logistics and supply chain management, and spent the next 30 years building a career through precision, patience, and a work ethic that had been installed in her so early it no longer felt like effort. By 58, she was a senior director at a regional logistics company, a position she had been passed over for twice before it was finally, and somewhat reluctantly, given to her. She owned her apartment outright. She had no debt. She had a small circle of people she trusted completely and a larger circle she treated with careful, cordial distance. She had never married, not from bitterness, but from a deep unwillingness to accept less than what she knew was possible. The one constant she had carried through every address, every promotion, every loss, was a narrow platinum bracelet set with 3 small diamonds. Understated, almost plain to a careless eye. The kind of piece that rewards attention. Dorothy Ashby bought the bracelet in 1994, the year Carol turned 30, though she had been saving for it quietly for 3 years prior. A small amount each month, set aside from an already stretched budget, kept in a plain envelope in the back of a kitchen drawer beneath the utility bills. Dorothy had first seen it in the window of Mr. Hennessy's jewelry store on Broad Street on a winter Tuesday in 1991 on her walk home from the laundry. She had stopped in front of that window. She had looked for a long time. She had not gone in that day. It was too cold, she was too tired, and she did not yet know whether she could make the numbers work. But she had gone back the following week to ask the price, and then she had gone home and started saving. She told no one she was doing this. She did not want it to become a conversation. She just wanted it to become real. What changed the plan was a diagnosis. In the spring of 1993, Dorothy was told she had ovarian cancer. She went through surgery and chemotherapy that took more from her physically than almost anything that had come before it. She lost weight, lost her hair, lost, for the first time in Carol's memory, the appearance of invincibility that had always seemed to be her most essential quality. But she did not lose her focus, because now the bracelet meant something different. Now it was not just a birthday gift. It was something she needed Carol to have while Dorothy was still alive to give it. She gave it to Carol at the kitchen table on an ordinary Thursday evening in November of 1993. Carol came over for dinner, and afterward, when Gary had gone to watch television, Dorothy slid a small velvet box across the kitchen table and said nothing. Carol opened it. She looked at the bracelet for a long time without speaking. When she finally looked up, Dorothy said the only thing she had prepared. "I didn't buy this so you'd have something pretty. I bought it so you'd always have something that couldn't be taken from you. Something real. Something that holds." Dorothy survived her cancer. She lived for another 11 years, long enough to watch Carol's career take hold, long enough to hold Kayla as a newborn, long enough to sit in that same kitchen on ordinary Sundays, being present with the particular devotion of someone who knows that time is not guaranteed. She died in 2004, on a Saturday morning in February, with Carol sitting beside her. Carol wore the bracelet to the funeral. She wore it to every hard thing that came after. She wore it the day she was passed over for her first promotion, and the second time, and the day she finally received the position she had earned. She pressed her fingers against it under the conference table when her name was announced, the way she always did when she needed to remember. "You have been here before. You are still standing." The Sunday dinner was held at Gary and Sandra's house in Westerville on a cool Sunday in October. These gatherings happened 4 or 5 times a year, and Sandra organized them with the enthusiasm of a woman who needed an audience, which is not entirely fair to say, but not entirely inaccurate either. Sandra had spent 20 years quietly measuring herself against Carol and quietly concluding that the measurements were not in her favor. Carol had the career. Carol had the apartment. Carol had the self-possession Sandra had always wanted and never quite managed to assemble in herself, no matter how carefully she arranged the centerpieces or how warmly she refilled the wine glasses. And so Sandra's warmth toward Carol had always carried a slightly practiced quality, a performance of sisterhood delivered with enough skill to fool the room, but not enough to fool anyone who had been watching long enough. Gary was fooled entirely and always had been. Aunt Ruth was not fooled at all and never had been. Kayla was 27, recently returned from 2 years in Europe with a confidence that had not yet been truly tested by life. She was not a bad person, but she had grown up in a household where Sandra's subtle dismissals of Carol were ambient, absorbed the way children absorb everything that is never explained to them. Kayla had grown up knowing, without knowing precisely why, that Carol was somehow less. That Carol's bracelet, which Kayla had been told at some point she could not even precisely remember had come from a flea market, was the kind of thing you wore when you could not afford the real thing. Aunt Ruth was 79. She had been Dorothy's closest friend, and she watched family gatherings with the quiet, unhurried attention of someone who has seen enough to know exactly what is happening without needing anyone to explain it. The dinner was roast chicken and scalloped potatoes. Sandra had made a centerpiece with small pumpkins and dried corn. The conversation moved through its usual channels. Carol listened, contributed when asked, and wore the bracelet as she always did, present, unremarkable to her, simply part of who she was. Kayla was talking about vintage markets in Paris, making an actually interesting point about trained versus untrained eyes, when her gaze landed on Carol's wrist. Something shifted, the weight of an assumption she had carried for years, never examined. She reached across. Her fingers closed around the bracelet. She slid it off Carol's wrist and held it to the light. "Didn't you always say this came from a flea market, Mom?" She said it lightly, like she was being charming. Sandra looked up and offered her perfected smile, the one that communicates everything while committing to nothing. Gary laughed nervously. Aunt Ruth set her fork down on her plate with a sound that was very precise in the sudden quiet. Carol held out her hand. Kayla placed the bracelet back into it. Carol slid it onto her wrist. She picked up her wine glass. She took a measured sip. And then she asked Gary how the new gutters were holding up after last week's rain. No correction. No defense. No visible damage. To everyone at that table except Aunt Ruth, it appeared that Carol had simply let the moment pass. But Aunt Ruth, who had known Carol since she was 7, understood exactly what had happened. Carol had not let it pass. Carol had filed it. And filing and letting go are two entirely different things. Carol drove home that evening with the radio on and the bracelet warm against her wrist. She was not devastated. She had spent too many years being underestimated by Sandra to be devastated by the latest version of it. What she felt was something more specific and more useful: clarity. There are moments in life when something that has been ambient and unspoken is finally made concrete and audible, and those moments, though uncomfortable, carry a particular gift inside them. They remove the ambiguity. They take away the possibility of telling yourself you misread the room. They show you, precisely and without softening, exactly what you are dealing with and exactly how long you have been dealing with it. Carol had been standing in Sandra's quiet dismissal for 20 years. She had told herself it was harmless, that it was just Sandra's way, that Gary loved them both, and that was enough to make a family. Now she knew it had been transmitted to Kayla. Now she knew it was generational. And now she decided to do something she had never done in 30 years of wearing that bracelet. She decided to find out, on paper, exactly what it was worth. She called the jewelry store on Broad Street the following Monday. Mr. Hennessy had retired, but his daughter Patricia had taken over the business and was still operating from the same location. Carol explained who she was, that her mother had purchased a bracelet from the shop in the early 90s, that she had worn it for 30 years without ever having it formally assessed. Patricia told her to come in on Wednesday. Carol did. Patricia Hennessy spent nearly 25 minutes examining the bracelet. She tested the metal, studied the setting under magnification, consulted a reference binder behind the counter. When she finally set the bracelet down on the velvet pad, she said, "Your mother had exceptional taste. The setting is custom platinum, hand-fabricated work that essentially does not exist at this price point anymore. The diamonds are VS1, well-matched, beautifully positioned. Based on current comparable sales, the auction estimate is between $11,000 and $14,000. For replacement value, the certificate will read $14,200. She paused. Your mother paid $800 for this in 1993. She got more than she paid for in every possible way. Carol thanked her, paid the fee, and folded the certificate into her bag. She walked to the coffee shop on the corner, ordered a black coffee, and sat by the window for 20 minutes. She was not triumphant. What she felt was something closer to sorrow. Not for herself, but for Dorothy, who had sacrificed and saved and chosen carefully and was still, 30 years after her death, having her judgment dismissed by people who had never once done anything as quietly extraordinary as what Dorothy Ashby had done every single day. Carol put the certificate on her kitchen counter that evening and looked at it. She thought, not yet. She was not ready to use it. She was going to wait for the right moment. And the right moment, she had learned from her mother, always came to those patient enough not to force it. Gary called midweek. He was apologetic in his circular way, moving around the point without landing on it. Kayla hadn't meant anything by it. Sandra felt terrible, though notably Sandra had not called to say so herself. Carol said she understood, said she was fine, changed the subject to something neutral. After she hung up, she looked at the certificate still on her kitchen counter. Then she texted Gary. Is the whole family coming to Thanksgiving? He replied within the hour, yes. The usual crowd. Carol wrote back, good. 3 days after the dinner, Kayla posted a photograph on social media, golden lit, warm, the dinner table with the pumpkin centerpiece and the candles. She had tagged everyone, including Carol. The caption was something about home and roots. Carol was visible at the edge of the frame, her left hand resting on the table. The bracelet caught the candlelight. One comment from a woman Carol did not know said, is that an antique piece on the woman to the left? The light catches it beautifully. Kayla responded within minutes. Huh. My aunt. Honestly, no idea where she got it. 6 words. Casual. Throwaway. Carol saw it at 7 in the morning on a Thursday, sitting at her kitchen table with her coffee. She read it twice. She put her phone face down on the table. She looked out the window at the Columbus sky for a long while. Then she picked up her phone and texted Gary. Carol arrived at Gary and Sandra's house on Thanksgiving carrying 2 bottles of good wine and the appraisal certificate in a plain white envelope at the bottom of her bag. She had not told anyone about the envelope. She had not fully decided whether she would use it. She had simply decided she wanted it close. The house was warm when she walked in. The smell of roasting turkey, a football game in the background, Kayla's voice from the kitchen. Ruth was already in the armchair she had claimed at every family gathering for as long as anyone could remember. She looked at Carol when Carol came in. Carol looked back. Ruth nodded once. That was sufficient. The first hour was uncomplicated. Sandra was generous with the wine. Gary was in good spirits. Carol moved through it at her usual register, present, warm when warmth was warranted. She ate the food, asked Ruth about her neighbor's dog, listened to Kayla describe a gallery opening she had attended. She was beginning to think, genuinely, that the evening would pass without incident and she would drive home with the envelope still sealed. Then Sandra made that impossible. The conversation had moved. Carol could not have said exactly how, to estate sales and antique fairs. Sandra said, in her warmest tone, that she had always admired women who had a relaxed approach to personal style. That some women were diamonds and pearls, and some were more eclectic. She looked at Carol as she said this, then picked up her wine and smiled. Kayla, who was her mother's daughter in this reflex, laughed lightly and said she had actually been meaning to apologize about the bracelet comment from the last dinner, that she was just repeating something she'd heard, that she hadn't meant any shade by it. No shade. 2 words that contained the entire architecture of the past month inside them. Carol set down her fork. She reached into her bag without hurry. She took out the white envelope and set it on the table in front of Kayla. She said, calmly and without any performance, "Go ahead. Open it." Kayla looked at the envelope. She looked at Carol. She opened it. She unfolded the certificate from Hennessy Fine Jewelry, with the letterhead, the description, and the replacement value of $14,200 in clean black type at the bottom. She read it. Carol watched her face move through its rooms. Confusion first, then sharp recalibration, then something that Carol recognized as the first honest emotion Kayla had directed at her in years. Carol spoke. Her voice was level and unhurried. The voice of a woman who had been preparing for this conversation not for weeks, but for a lifetime. She said, "My mother's name was Dorothy Ashby. She worked 2 jobs for 23 years to raise Gary and me after our father left. She saved for 3 years, from an already stretched income, to buy that bracelet from a man named Hennessy on Broad Street because she saw it in his window and decided her daughter deserved something real. She gave it to me early because she had just been diagnosed with cancer and was not willing to wait. She told me she bought it, so I would always have something that couldn't be taken from me. I have worn it for 30 years. I wore it to her funeral." She paused, one beat. "I did not get it appraised to prove a price. I got it appraised because I wanted a document that said clearly, this is real, this matters, and I am not going to sit at this table again and pretend otherwise." The room was entirely still. Gary looked like a man forced to understand, finally, the cost of standing equidistant between 2 people for 20 years. Sandra was looking at her wine glass. Kayla was still holding the certificate in both hands. Then, from the far end of the table, Aunt Ruth's voice came, dry and clear and carrying the weight of 79 years. "Good." Just that single word. It landed in the silence like a verdict. Kayla did not sleep well that night. She lay in her childhood bedroom looking at the ceiling, thinking about Dorothy Ashby saving 3 years of a stretched income for a piece of jewelry for a daughter she was afraid she might not live to see grow old. She thought about how easily she had slid that bracelet off Carol's wrist without asking. She thought about typing honestly no idea where she got it on a public post without a second thought. She thought about the particular ease with which she had dismissed someone she had never actually looked at directly. 2 days after Thanksgiving, Kayla posted again, no photograph, just text. Long, unedited, the kind of post only written after a night of not sleeping and a morning of sitting with discomfort you cannot talk yourself out of. She wrote about the dinner, the bracelet, the certificate, and the story of Dorothy Ashby that Carol had told in 8 sentences over a family table. She wrote that she had been casually unkind to her aunt for years without examining it, because she had absorbed a set of assumptions from people she trusted without ever questioning whether those assumptions were fair or true. She wrote that she had reached across a table and taken something off someone's wrist without asking, had held it up in the light and laughed, and had never stopped to consider what that bracelet actually was, or what it had cost, or who had given it. She wrote that Carol's response, patient, quiet, and in the end completely unanswerable, had shown her the difference between the appearance of confidence and its actual substance. She ended with, "Aunt Carol, I am sorry. I am sorry I grabbed your bracelet without asking. I am sorry I repeated something careless as though it were fact. I am sorry it took me this long to actually see you. The bracelet is beautiful. You are beautiful, and I should have known better. I do now." The post was shared widely. Hundreds of comments came from women who recognized the pattern, the ambient dismissal of a certain kind of woman, the particular loneliness of being underestimated by your own family, the decades-long accumulation of small moments that are individually easy to dismiss and collectively impossible to ignore. Several women wrote about their own mothers, about jewelry passed down and misunderstood and reclaimed, about the things we carry that other people cannot see the weight of until we finally decide to put them on the table. Carol saw the post. She read it twice. She did not comment publicly. She picked up her phone and sent Kayla one text. "Thank you." That took courage. Kayla responded immediately with a single heart. Carol put her phone down and went to make coffee. That evening, Carol sat by the window in her apartment with a glass of red wine and the bracelet on her wrist. She turned her wrist slightly in the lamplight, the way her mother used to hold things up when she was checking them, tilting them just enough to catch the glow. The three small diamonds returned the light exactly as they always had. She thought about her mother saving in secret, about a winter Tuesday in Columbus when Dorothy had walked past a jewelry store window on Broad Street and stopped, about the 11 years between the cancer diagnosis and the death. 11 years Dorothy spent attending every important moment, being present with the particular devotion of someone who knows that time is not guaranteed. She thought about the word that Sandra had never been able to understand about Carol, and that Kayla had only just begun to learn. It was not confidence, though Carol had that. It was not success, though she had built that too from nothing, over decades, without anyone handing her a starting position or a safety net. The word was grounded. Carol Ashby was grounded in something that could not be appraised and could not be dismissed at a dinner table and could not be slid off her wrist by a careless hand and diminished. She was grounded in the knowledge of where she had come from and what it had cost, and who had paid that cost with their own body and their own years and their own plain envelope in a kitchen drawer. You cannot take that from someone. You can underestimate it. You can smile your smile at it across a dinner table for 20 years. But you cannot take it. Dorothy had been right. Some things hold. Carol took a sip of wine. She was not thinking about the appraisal certificate, which was back in its envelope, returned to the place where things that have done their work are stored. She was thinking about her mother walking home from the laundry on a winter afternoon, seeing something in a window, and making a decision quietly, without telling anyone, without asking for recognition. She was thinking about how long it takes for some decisions to arrive at their full meaning. 30 years, in this case. 30 years of a bracelet sitting on her wrist through every hard thing, every important thing, every ordinary Tuesday that turned out to matter more than she knew at the time. Holding. Simply, quietly, absolutely holding. If this story stayed with you, and we believe it will, we want to hear from you in the comments. Tell us what this brought up for you. Tell us about the women in your life who carried things quietly for years and were underestimated by the very people who should have known better. Tell us about the moment when the truth finally arrived at the table and refused to be politely ignored any longer. Tell us about the pieces you inherited that meant more than anyone around you understood. We read every single comment, and we are genuinely grateful that you are here with us. And if someone you love needs to hear this story today, someone who has been carrying something real in a world that has not yet taken the time to see it, please share this with them. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is simply hand them the receipt.